Stephen Kinzer is a veteran New York Times correspondent who has reported from 50 countries on 5 continents. During the 1980s, he covered revolution and upheaval in Central America. In the 1990s, he covered Eastern and Central Europe as they were emerging from Soviet rule. From 1996, he was the New York Times bureau chief in Istanbul, Turkey. His several books include All the Shah's Men: An American Coup, a book that when I read it, I was just absolutely ecstatic. I mean, here was one of the greatest books I've ever read that encapsulated in easily readable form what the U.S. government had done in Iran in 1953 and the consequences, the blowback from that policy and what they did. And then he's got another book, his most recent, at least on foreign policy, Overthrow: A Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, which was just about as good as the Iran book, giving a whole summary of regime change operations as part of U.S. foreign policy from the time of the Hawaii takeover through the Spanish-American War and all the way up through Iraq. And so we tried to get Stephen to come last year, and he was not able to make it, and we were ecstatic. We were really excited that he accepted our invitation. It is a tremendous honor to have him with us today. Please welcome Stephen Kinzer.
That was great. Thank you. Thanks so much. What an honor to share a platform with such a remarkable figure and to be flanked by the portraits of such great figures. You know, I think that one of the things that has happened recently in the last year or two is something that the Ron Paul campaign both reflected and helped cause. And that is, I think it's the breakdown of the traditional right-left separation on foreign policy. That doesn't exist anymore. I've spent the last several days on Capitol Hill meeting some of those members that Ron was referring to. And I, too, was told that a great bill we put in to try to halt the rush to war in Iran had to be deleted from a bill because it was too controversial. And what it said was, no war can be declared unless Congress agrees. That is now a controversial statement. And it's so much so that it can't even be included in a law passed by the U.S. Congress. Now, while I was up there, I was really impressed to see that there are a handful of people up there very much opposed to the idea of our continued involvement in regime change operations. And we found some very conservative Republicans and some very liberal Democrats on that side. So I think the divisions in American politics are changing. New coalitions are emerging. I think if there could be one possible good benefit that came out of the Iraq War, it might be that for at least a time, which we can now take advantage of, Americans are beginning to realize that we can't control events in every part of the world, and maybe this isn't such a good idea. So those of us that have always said nothing good can come out of the Iraq War might find there was one little exception. Now, I really enjoyed staring when I could tear my eyes off Congressman Paul at that picture of Thomas Jefferson, particularly for one reason. Thomas Jefferson is the author of the phrase that I take as my guiding principle. And it's the principle that has pushed me through all the books I've written. I actually had this up on my wall 20 years ago when I was a correspondent in Nicaragua, and I've followed it ever since. It's a line from the Declaration of Independence, and it reflects my view. I don't consider myself a polemicist or an ideologue or a Bush basher, but I am reality-based. I'm fact-based. I like to deal with what's real, not with visionary fantasies of utopia. And in the Declaration of Independence, it says, "Let facts be submitted to a candid world." That is all we are trying to do. This is not a radical departure, the foreign policy that we are trying to promote. What we're trying to promote is actually the foreign policy that George Bush promised us in his first debate. If we're strong but humble, they'll respect us. That's true, but what happened to that? It's the political process that Ron Paul talked about that sucks people into this Republican-Democrat combine. And that is the real difference on Capitol Hill. It's those in the large majority who are part of this Republican-Democrat group, and then there are the few outsiders. That's the real division. And I think the challenge for us is to make sure that those few outsiders don't remain a few. We need to keep building up that group. And one of the ways I think we can do that is to show America that we now have an example going on every day in the Middle East of what our interventionist foreign policy brings. You don't have to look into the history books anymore. You don't even have to buy my books anymore. You can read it every day in the newspaper. And the tragic toll of this war is just the latest in a long series of episodes that have put us into a position so different from the America that our founding fathers imagined. You know, when John Winthrop wrote, "We shall be as a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us," what he meant, as he explained in his other writings, was we're going to create a great system in a great country here. And then, if other countries like some things that we're doing, they can copy us. That was what he meant. But at some point somewhere in the 19th century, we abandoned that position. And we decided that we're not just going to set an example. We're going to go out in the world and make everyone be like us. We decided that we'd found the magic key to prosperity and democracy, and we were going to share that with everyone else. And not coincidentally, that kind of democracy that we envisioned meant the access of American corporations to the resources of the whole world on the terms that we decide were just for us, and a policy which used to be called the open door policy, which I like to call the kick in the door policy. It was forcing ourselves on every country. Now we've gone so far to the point where in our last quadrennial defense review, we have declared as the official policy of the United States that we are not going to tolerate even the beginnings of the rise of any country that could one day become a peer power, they call it. In other words, what we've told the world is we've decided that no other countries are allowed to try to increase their power. Now, if all the leaders of all the countries in the world read that and say, oh, I guess America doesn't want us to increase our power, so we won't do it. We'll just do what they say. That would be wonderful. This is an example of the magic wand theory of government, I like to call it. But that can't happen. In fact, countries logically want to increase their power, and that means they're automatically going to come in conflict with the United States. This doctrine is a recipe for constant conflict, constant war, constant intervention. You know, a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, I had a debate with a prominent neoconservative columnist and theorist who was a great promoter of the Iraq War and now wants to bomb Iran yesterday. And during my opening statement, I thoughtlessly used a phrase that really got him going. And I said that the policy you guys are trying to follow is really the modern version of Trotskyism. It's constant revolution. And he took great umbrage at this. I hadn't really thought it through, but actually a lot of these neocons are ex-Trotskyites from their college days. So he got very nervous about that. So I said to him, okay, excuse me, please, I didn't mean to insult you. If you don't consider yourself a Trotskyite, what do you consider yourself? What historical tradition would you place yourself in? And he said, well, how about a Wilsonian? I want to ask, what's the difference? Now, as you heard earlier, I've written a series of books about the history of American intervention. I wrote a book about how the U.S. overthrew the government of Guatemala in the 50s, and another book about how the U.S. overthrew the government of Iran. I've written also a book about Nicaragua that talks a lot about American intervention there. After each of those books, I really felt satisfied that I had told the whole truth. You know, people didn't know what had really happened in Guatemala, but I went out there and I ripped the veil of lies off and I told the whole truth and showed everyone what really happened. I felt very satisfied with myself, but you know, that emotion never lasts long. And after a while, I began to realize that I really hadn't told the whole story. There was one thing that was missing. I came to realize that if you want to understand American intervention abroad and all these coups and overthrows and interventions that we've carried out, you cannot consider them as a series of distinct, unrelated episodes. You have to look at them as a continuum that stretches out over more than 100 years.